It is my honor to mention the fact that this workshop is named after Hilda and Gilbert Davis. They endowed a lecture series for Ministers Week, and we are privileged to have Mark Davis of the Davis family with us. And I've asked him or invited him to say a few words, but Gilbert Davis was a longtime member of TCU, worked with church relations. He also served disciples churches in North Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas. And so we are grateful to the Davis family for this lectureship, and I have invited Mark to just say a few words about what motivated it for his folks.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and just to say something about Gilbert and Hilda Davis, because when you got them, when you hired Gilbert Davis, you always got two for the price of one. And so that's why I think it's so appropriate that Hilda is with them. And Gilbert was very associated with Ministers Week over a long period of time. This is the first live Ministers Week that he has not attended, and he passed away just before Ministers Week last year, which was an online experience. But prior to that, and many of you have heard this, that Gilbert attended Ministers Week for 75 consecutive years. And I took him to the Blois Camp meeting in about 2018, where he had preached years ago. He had been the preacher for 9 years, and I took him back, and they introduced one of the people in the congregation that had been attending the Blois Camp meeting for 100 years. And she came as an infant and as a grandchild of Reverend Blois. And so I told Gilbert he was nothing from, that point on, anytime anybody brought up the 75 years. But he loved this event particularly because of his long history with Ministers Week. And he had been the Wells preacher at one time, and there were always the Wells sermons, the Scott lectures, and the McFadden lectures. And at some point, I'm not sure how long, this has been going a long time, but this workshop was named in honor of my parents, and it meant very much to him because it's about practical ministry and the church on the ground, and all the programs have just been outstanding. So I just slipped in today because I had to see what was going on, and I appreciate the opportunity to mention my parents, and I welcome all of you, and I hope you have a great session.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to your family for their contribution to this week and to our learning. We will now be hearing from Dr. Khalia Williams, and she will be introduced by Dr. Natalia Cherry. Dr. Cherry is a colleague of mine at Brite Divinity School. She is Associate Professor of Methodist Studies and Theology, and she will be introducing Dr. Williams and then managing the Q&A afterwards. So please welcome Dr. Cherry.
Y'all just heard a word of prophecy out of the mouth of Dr. Barbara McClure. And because our interim president is in the room, I'm going to acknowledge it. I am the assistant professor in Methodist Studies and Theology until, please God, next year, when you will be able to hear from me as a tenured professor. But in the meantime, it is a joy to be here with you, and especially to be introducing our Davis Workshop speaker. I don't just say that because the institution she blesses with her professional presence is one of the 13 United Methodist Schools of Theology, and that is close to my heart as a result, but because she herself is such a gift to the Church Universal. Reverend Dr. Khalia J. Williams is the Associate Dean of Worship and Spiritual Formation, the Associate Professor in the Practice of Worship, and co-director of the Baptist Studies program at Candler School of Theology, Emory University. She is an ordained minister with standing in both the American Baptist Church and Disciples of Christ Christian Church. As a liturgical artist, she is sought after for her worship leadership, her vision for integrating worship and the arts, and her expertise in womanist spirituality and worship. Her research centers on womanist liturgical theology, which explores the ways African American women experience God and live out their spirituality through their bodies. She is a professionally trained classical ballet and modern dancer, and continues to impact the dance community in various forms of teaching and consultations. Dance Theater of Harlem is on campus as we speak. I have to think this is a confluence of body and spirit in some wonderful ways. In addition, Dr. Williams serves as an associate minister at Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, in addition to the roles she carries out at the general ministry level in the DOC. She is busy, and so we are blessed that she has made time to be with us. She is married to Reverend Dr. Damon P. Williams, and they are the proud parents of 2 boys, Thomas and Ethan. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, okay, so you heard her say that I was ordained Baptist, right? That automatically means I like to have a lot of conversation in the room. So let's try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. Wonderful. Thank you, Natalia, for the introduction and for all of the hospitality to the team here that has coordinated and is leading Ministers Week. I am so grateful for the invitation and the opportunity, and to Rowena Tart for all of her wonderful administration coordinating and getting me here, and then to Mark Davis and the Davis family for having the foresight, the vision, and the desire to endow such a lectureship so that I could one day be here. I say thank you to your family as well. Thank you. So you heard a little bit of my bio. There are a few things that I want to highlight because I think before we do anything, we have to first get to know one another. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and highlight a few things that really inform the conversation we are going to have today. And then I am going to invite you to tell me a little bit about yourself. And then we're going to dive right in. So first and foremost, as was mentioned, I am a wife and mom. That is my husband, and that's my 7-year-old on the left side of me, which would be your right side, Thomas, and my 5-year-old, Ethan. Now, if you read the title of this workshop, it's Worship That Breathes. Anyone who has ever been around little children for long enough know it takes a whole lot of breath and patience. So they obviously are informing where I am coming from on today. In addition to that, I am a worship practitioner and researcher, specifically steeped in womanist liturgical theology. That is the hermeneutic by which I enter into everything that I do. If you never heard of it or even delved into what womanism is, write it down and read it a little bit later. There are a few parts of womanism that completely make up my entire theological view, both as a researcher and a practitioner. Those 2 parts are, 1, looking and seeking for the wholeness of the entire community. So always looking for what is right and best for the whole of the community, but also always entering into my conversations on theology, my conversations on worship, my conversations on anything, recognizing those on the margins, and then beginning to start the conversations from where those on the margins are entering into the conversation. In addition to that, I am a dancer. And so you will see me moving around a whole lot. I can't stand still. It's my nature. I will move as much as possible throughout this entire time. It's just how I operate. It's how my brain thinks. So that is another part to know about me. In addition to that, as was shared, I am the Associate Dean of Worship and Spiritual Formation at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and I serve as Executive Minister, and I just so happen to be married to the pastor, so also First Lady, at Providence Missionary Baptist Church. Church in Atlanta, Georgia. So you've had a chance to get to know a little bit about me. And now I'd like to know who you are. So on the count of 3, I am simply going to ask you to tell me your name, and by then I'll know everyone. 1, 2, 3. Look at that. And we are now fast friends. There we go. And now we can engage in a transparent and very friendly conversation because we have now established ourselves to be wonderful forever friends. So if you ever see me from here on out, remember, you now have a friend. If I look at you, I will remember your name. If I do remember your name, I should be paid $1 million. I really should. But hey, here we go. So for the next 2 hours or so that we are going to be together, we're going to cover a couple of things. This is how we're going to move. We're going to talk a little bit about foundations. What is this thing when I say worship that breathes? We're going to talk and explore some themes. In there, you will get a coffee break to breathe, and there will be homework for your coffee break for you to do. We'll deal a little bit about application of these themes probably before we move to our coffee break. We'll see how time works. And then we'll look at we'll practice an imaginative exercise. So just make sure you like the people that you're around because you are going to be in imaginative conversation with those who you are sitting with. And then we will move into our time of Q&A. So let's dive in. Before I dive in, audio, I hear there's popping on my mic. Do I need to move it at all, or are we good? Move it a little bit? How's that? Good for you? Okay, there we go. Good. So let's get started. Foundations. Everyone take a deep breath in and exhale. Now let's try that again. And this time I invite you to pay close attention to your body as you do it. Take a deep breath in and exhale. What just happened? Shout it out. What'd you feel? Shoulders relaxed. Heart rate slowed. Settled. I heard something else over here. Stomach loosened, shoulders relaxed, heart rate slowed, felt settled, stomach loosened. What else? Relaxed. Lungs were filled. Focused. So physiologically, there's something that's happening when we take a deep breath. What's happening when we breathe? Scientifically, when we breathe, we are doing what? We are taking in oxygen. The oxygen then enters into our bloodstream. And then in our exhale, what happens? We exhale out carbon monoxide, right? Carbon dioxide, actually, is what we... let's clear that one up really quick. So that's what's happening scientifically when we're breathing, right? And what you just did when you took a deep breath is you were very intentional about the breathing process. You paid attention, that's why I asked you to do it a second time, to what your body felt and your body's response when you did what? Inhaled in and exhaled. Why is breath important? Life. If we're not breathing, we're not living, right? That's just that. If we are not breathing, we are not living. That is the central focus around what I want to talk about today, and not just the practice of breathing that we just did, but this idea and this concept of breathing. So back in 2019, I had the opportunity to participate in a cohort with Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning. And in that cohort, I was able to spend a year journeying with about 10 other colleagues, and we journeyed for a year thinking through, talking about and learning what it means to be researchers, scholars, and practitioners in theological education or religious institutions, And our particular cohort focused around embodiment. It only made sense. I'm a dancer. All the things I do and think about are embodied practices. And so it made sense that I was a part of this group. So we journeyed for a year. We got to the end of the year, and Wabash said, hey, I want you all to think of a project to go on and just kind of research out and dive into deeply for the next year. What a gift. About the time that they said this, I was teaching a course, my Womanist, Feminist, Spirituality, and Worship course. And that course is usually a seminar course, about 15 students max. Usually it's second or third year master's level students. This particular year, I had about 3 or 4 first year MDiv students, so they are just coming in. And they are taking all these ridiculous, overwhelming lecture courses and all of that. And I have a student who walks into the class. She plops down in a chair. She lets out a deep sigh. And she says, now I can be human. Of course, I wasn't supposed to hear her say that, but I'm that kind of professor that ear hustles in the room, so I'm always listening as my students are coming in, and she was talking to a colleague, and so I just kind of sat there, and they started talking, and it kind of went on to something else. But that little moment, wasn't even 10 seconds, stuck with me for a while. And it wasn't the I can be human that stuck with me. It was the deep breath that stuck with me. So I took advantage of the opportunity to dive deeply, based on Wabash's invitation, into developing what I have termed to be a pedagogy of breath. How do we teach theological education in a rhythm of breath? And so I've constructed over the last 2 years, this way of actually facilitating the classroom space literally in a rhythm of breath, in a rhythm of breathing. And I've introduced some breathing into the classroom. So while I had this year to dive deeply into developing this particular pedagogical process, this particular way of teaching, one of the things that I did was I spent 6 months working with a breath coach. Who knew there were breath coaches? Somebody raised their hand. You all are way ahead, because I had no idea. I just randomly Googled. I figured I've done yoga, there's breathing there. And then it took me down this whole rabbit hole, and there's like a real thing called breath work. And it's huge. And I was able to get with an amazing breath coach who is also theologically trained. So she got it when I said, I'm coming to do research. I want to do the breath work with you, but I also want to get behind the theory of it. I want to learn a little more about it. So we spent 6 months, and we would have these breath sessions. And I mean, these breath sessions, my goodness, you're breathing intentionally for like an hour. And all you're doing is breathing intentionally for like an hour. You would think I breathe all day, every day. That's the way that I'm living. But when you breathe intentionally for an hour, it's a whole different experience. And so she took me through what is called circular breathing. And we went through this method, and she taught me a lot about the theory. And there are some things that I've learned and picked up that were so informative to my developing this method of teaching. Well, it just so happens that a number of our breath sessions would happen on Thursday afternoons following the worship services that I would run in Candler School of Theology's Cannon Chapel. So I would run worship. We'd finish worship, I'd grab a quick bite to eat, I'd come, I'd set up my laptop. When I say this is a real thing, it's a real thing, because I had to lay down on my couch and position the laptop so she can see me breathing and be able to coach me through it. And I did all of that with worship in mind, because this was also the time that I would normally stop and reflect on the service that just happened and then look at the services that we have upcoming. And so now my research and my practice are starting to collide in my mind. And lo and behold, after a few weeks of that rhythm, it dawned on me, I'm doing this to think about how to teach worship in a theological space, but what about our worship breathing in and of itself? Is there anything that I can learn from this that can speak to the way in which we are worshiping in our communal worship spaces? So that became kind of what I like to call parking lot. Note I put down, I can't go down that rabbit hole just yet. I have to focus over here because there's 50 million things. You heard Dr. Cherry read off my bio, a whole lot happening. And so I have to kind of compartmentalize. And then after I was able to work out and do this pedagogy of breath and practice it out for about 1.5 years, a couple of iterations of it, in teaching worship, I began to incorporate and think about how can this then inform our worship practices. And so that's where we're going today. We're going to look at some of the themes that came up from my particular breathwork journey and all the things that I've done, but we're going to look at it from the particular question, what are we doing when we worship? What are we doing when we worship? And not only what are we doing when we worship, because one of the questions that really jumped out to me was how are we called to worship? How is God inviting us to worship? How does God call us to worship? Sounds. Singing. Say it again. Praise. Visual. Surrendered. Ceaselessly. So I'm going to even go even broader, right? We have a biblical text that tells us that God is spirit. And those who worship God must worship God in and in, let's talk about spirit. I started to think about that word spirit. Those who worship God must worship God in spirit, John 4:24. Then I began to look and explore this word spirit. Spirit derived from the word spiritus, the Latin word, and spiritus meaning breath, breathing. God is breath, and those who worship God must worship in breath and truth. This implies with our breath, sound, singing, but it also implies actually in breath, in a rhythm or a model of breathing, which then begs the question, is our worship breathing? Is our worship doing the thing that God has invited us to do? To breathe. And what does that even mean? Worshiping in breath. So to answer these questions, we'll look through 5 themes that I've pulled from my time studying breath work and breathing that I believe can help inform the how of our worship, that can answer the question, is our worship breathing? Now, these are only 5. There are a number of them, but these 5 kind of bring about an umbrella, and I know I only have now 90 minutes with you, but there's a coffee break included in there with homework. So I can't go through all of them, but I will go through an umbrella, and then I will definitely recommend if there are any questions or anywhere that you want me to go a little bit deeper, let's go there with the Q&A time. But I will kind of give some overarching umbrellas. So the first lesson from breathing was intentionality in preparation and practice. So while I was in this breath work, I told you all, I had sessions that I would have to come down, I had to carve out time, in my calendar. I had to come downstairs to my office after the chapel, set things up, make sure the laptop is set. There was a lot of preparation that went into it. And then there was about 60 minutes of practice. And the preparation had to be intentional, all the way down to testing the temperature of my office, because once I lay down and get on Zoom with the breath coach, I didn't want to have to disrupt and break and get up and say, let me grab a jacket or a blanket or whatever. So I had to figure all of that out so I could be fully present in the moment of the practice. And then while in the practice, I had to be very intentional about what was being asked of me to do. Now, I told you earlier, she had me going. Her name is Dr. Kelly Walden. She was amazing, or is an amazing breath coach. And Kelly had me going through circular breathing, which is a particular way of breathing. And so I had to be mindful about practicing the circular breath, not falling into deep cleansing breath. There's like 50 million breaths that you could actually breathe, by the way, right? So not falling into the deep cleansing breath, or not accidentally slipping off to sleep while we're in the process of the breathing, because that was very easy. And sometimes I was like, hey, Kelly, I might need this nap. Just let me have it for a minute. Give me 10 minutes, you know? But there was intentionality about preparation and how I showed up in the practice that I think was very, very valuable. The second lesson, we're going to go back through these and apply them to worship after I run through them this first time. The second lesson that I pulled is this cyclical rhythm. That's the circular breath. And there's some amazing things that happen in this cyclical rhythm. So in circular breath, what I found and learned after diving even deeper into the theory of it, and it's why this particular breath method fascinates me, circular breath allows you to pull in way more oxygen than you've ever been able to pull in on a regular basis. And so the theory is that we actually only really operate off of 30% of our oxygen capacity. So that means we could actually take in 70% more oxygen into our body. And if we're able to take in more oxygen, we're able to fuel our brains even more. And the more oxygen you take in, the more operating that happens in the brain waves. So the idea is you breathe more, your brain is functioning more. You breathe less, your brain function slows down. And so the circular breath begins to bring in a whole lot more oxygen because you are literally pushing it in, through, and around your body at a quicker rate. And you're pulling in a lot more oxygen. Now, don't go home and Google circular breath and try to do it. Because I will tell you, after the first couple of times, like, you need to just pause for a minute. Because there was a moment of taking in more oxygen than my body had ever actually experienced in a given amount of time that kind of throws your equilibrium off. You don't want to drive a car after you've done that. You actually want to sit, because your body's not used to it. You're introducing something new. I'm dropping words out here that's going to be very helpful when we get to applying it to worship. I hope you all are catching it. So that's the cyclical rhythm. Another thing out of this cyclical rhythm, this kind of continuum that never stops, but is always kind of pulling in and pushing out, pulling in and pushing out, a huge benefit of that is it makes room for creativity. So those, again, in the theory of it, the study says those who have engaged in circular breathing, in this cyclical rhythm of breathing, find themselves to be much more creative after having practiced it for a while than they've ever been before. Because again, more oxygen comes in, the more functioning in the brain creates more room for creativity. And not only did I learn about this idea of making room for creativity, then I learned about this creating space for flexibility. Now, these last two themes don't come out of I attribute them to the breath work, but more so my living into the breath work in the classroom, teaching worship in this rhythm of breath. I found that it creates space for flexibility. And then finally, there comes communal transformation. Create space for flexibility, and then communal transformation. I'm going to read a little something very quick. So I was reflecting and writing on the communal transformation part of what it means to teach worship in this rhythm of worship. And as I was reflecting on it, I realized that one of the lessons that I learned from teaching worship in this breath with rhythm was breath led to laughter. Laughter led to joy. Joy led to transformation, even in the smallest ways. And shared transformation led to deep learning. This is in a classroom talking about worship. Now let's imagine what can happen if we bring this into how we worship. Okay? You all with me? Yes? And I'm right on time. Okay. So you don't know, but Dr. Cherry has this timeline that I have to stick by. And so I'm looking to make sure I'm right by the time I know. We have talked about being led by however the Spirit flows upstairs. That's where we're going to go. So let's apply these themes in worship and talk specifically about how these relate to our liturgical practice. And not just our personal private practices. I am speaking specifically to public worship. We can talk about how this may show up in private worship spaces, but I want to speak this specifically to our public worship spaces. So I showed you our first theme, intentionality in preparation and practice. Just off the top of your head, how do you think this shows up in worship? Planned liturgies. Come on here. She just stole the whole theme. Knowing why you are doing what you are doing. Planned liturgies. Knowing why you are doing what you are doing. Who else? Intentionality. Yes. Flow. How do we flow? Where are we going? What are we doing? Absolutely. Looking at it before you get there, spending time with it. Knowing who you have in the space. All of this is intentional preparation. Knowing what you're doing, planning your liturgy, looking at it before you get there, knowing how things are going to flow, knowing who's in the space, thinking about it all ahead of time. Now, I am a believer that we are all in these wonderfully adept worship spaces, and so we are always intentionally prepared. And we walk into worship, and everything is perfect and laid out, and there are no mistakes, no mishaps, nothing whatsoever. You all are already living into this first theme of intentionality and preparation. Everyone just say amen and make me feel good. Thank you. Okay. I like to believe that that's what the world of worship is like out there. Just feed my fantasy for a minute, please. So there's the intentionality in preparation, and then the intentionality also in practice. So we talked a lot about the preparation piece of it, but also it's being fully aware in the practice. Being fully aware and focused, fully aware of what? The bodies in space, what they're doing, what we are asking as worship leaders, individuals to do and to engage. Even paying attention when the best planned liturgy is actually put into practice and something doesn't quite feel right. because I wrote the language in a particular way, but when I hear it come out of the mouth of those who's leading in the space of the people who are gathered, ooh, I missed it. Paying attention to that. Paying attention to when you feel the room relax into the liturgy or when you feel the room tense up in the liturgy. That's the intentionality in practice. And there's also the very intentional opportunity of asking people to breathe. So while I was doing this and I started asking the questions about worship, I also started to do something. It was a little social experiment. You know, don't tell the folks over at Candler School of Theology that I'm experimenting on them. But I started opening almost every worship service after preliminary remarks, welcoming our preacher, before we moved into the start of service by inviting everyone to do what I did at the very beginning. Take a deep breath in and exhale. And I started to do this every single service. So think about it, 2 services a week I'm doing this. Just about, I would say 98% of the services I do that. And then as I was reflecting, I asked the individuals, not just students, because the most critical folks who ever have worked in theological institutions know that faculty have the most to say about what happens in the chapel space. I love our faculty, I do. And I love the honesty and the candor with which I can be in conversation. And so I kind of, approached the topic and had some conversations and just said, hey, what do you think about the times at the beginning of service when you're asked to take a deep breath in? I'm going to show you 4 responses that I received. 3 of them are from faculty members. 1 of them is from a student. And I'll just show you the quotes that I pulled quotes from their larger remarks. But I did ask several, and this is only 4 of them, and a lot of them, they kind of encompass the overall theme. So the first one was, it allows me to actually start the service focused in the moment. So I said, say more. And this is particularly a faculty member who said, well, when I enter into worship, my mind is not actually on worship, because my mind is on the class that I just taught, or the class that I'm about to teach, or the fact that I need to go pack up my bags and that my kid gets up. So she's like going down the list of all the different things that are on her mind. And it wasn't until we implemented the practice of me simply saying, and now let us take a deep breath in and exhale, that she was able to start worship focused in the moment. This is intentional practice. Bringing someone to the place where they can actually focus in the moment. A gentleman said, I realized it was the first time I stopped to actually focus on my breath in a few days. We breathe all day, every day, but we don't think about breathing all day, every day. And this was the first time that he actually stopped to think about breath. Now, me, being the preacher that I am, said, well, there's a little something sermon in here. Every now and then, if we stop and think about breath, and our breath comes from God, now we've stopped to think about a God who does something for us that we never even reflect on, that we often just take for granted. Just the act of inviting individuals to intentionally breathe at the beginning of a worship service allows them to focus on breath, but really focus on the God of breath in a way that we've never done before. Then I had a student say it's grounding. And this is important for this particular student to say that it is grounding. This student is a second-year MDiv student. And to know this student is to know grounding is so very far from her personality. But for her to recognize and then be able to kind of stop and feel what it is to be grounded, and then to learn a practice that can ground her in this moment as she enters into worship, I think is indeed a gift. And then the last one that I will share with you is one that was definitely an overall theme of feeling connected to God and to the people in worship with them. So that one, because I heard it a lot from those that I did inquire, and when I say I talked to folks, in total, we had about 75 different individuals that I've talked to gain all of the responses, and I'm not done querying all of them. But that one was interesting because the assumption is you're coming to worship in a community. You're coming to worship in community, a God who calls us to worship in community. So somewhere there's a connection. But the reality that we often enter into worship to do the thing that we do by routine, not necessarily by deep connection. So this is the gift and how we can think about the ways in which this theme of intentional preparation and practice that's learned from this, practice of breathing shows up in our actual worship life. So theme number 2, the cyclical rhythms. Imagine our worship not as separate services that begin and then end, and we come back and it begins and it ends, and we come back and it begins and it ends, but rather it's a continuum. It's a cyclical experience. Dr. Cindy Lee, over at Fuller Seminary, wrote a book. The book is called Unforming. And in the book, I thought I had it for it. Wait, there we go. In the book, Dr. Lee says, in a cyclical spirituality, our interactions with God are continuous. There's no point where we finish or complete our formation, so there is no hurry to be done. How many of us know about hurried worship? But if we think about our worship practice in this cyclical rhythm that does not have a beginning or an end, then we're never hurried to be done. That's not to say we stay in worship for 12 hours, but it is to say that we are not ending when we leave. We continue. Our lives continue, the worship that happened in the communal space, and comes back in. When we come back to our communal space, we are continuing in this worship experience. This is the cyclical nature that we learn out of breath work that I believe can completely transform the way we understand how we engage worship as a community, because now we are never disconnecting from God, nor are we disconnecting from one another or the worship practice. It's all continuous. And it's all cyclical, not linear. So we love to think of things as like linear progression. We start here, right? Even spiritual growth, spiritual development, how do we know we're growing? Because we're growing on this line that we've made. So if I am increasing and moving forward here, but that's not really life. Because if we live life, and Cindy Lee in this book actually says it wonderfully, she brings in a very, very nice way of thinking about it. If we understand life, not necessarily in a linear progression, but actually in this really kind of weird flow of ups and downs and experiences, and that's just how it is. And we don't look at our progression to God as linear, but God being with us in kind of the cyclical rhythm of our life, then we can look at our worship as God calling us to worship in this very cyclical rhythm of our spirituality. And that helps us then to connect and not feel like I have to start this service and it's a brand new service, and then it has to end, and then we send all the people out. And then next Sunday, they have to come back, and we start a brand new service, and then we end it, and we send them out. That's not even the way the lectionary operates, for those who are lovers of lectionary, as am I. There is a cyclical rhythm even to the Revised Common Lectionary. There's connection. So what we should be feeling then is there's service, there's theme, there's message, there's all this that happens, and we send folks out in the spirit of what's happening, and we welcome them back in, and we pick back up and we continue forward, right? And there's never this ending. So there's this cyclical rhythm that's there. Now let's talk about the cyclical rhythm, the not stopping and starting and starting and stopping and stopping and starting, makes room then for creativity. So just think about that. How can you imagine your worship making room for creativity? What needs to happen for worship to make room for creativity? Crayons, yes. You went to my favorite part right there. Ooh, I've never done that. Play-Doh. We do that at the seminary. I might need to take that to Providence. Say it again. So you want to come give the lecture because you're like nailing it here. You are right. It creates this openness. The cyclical rhythm, not having to start and stop, creates some room and an openness for us to be creative because we're not rushed to get somewhere. But we actually have a little wiggle room. And we can then open up our minds to imagining how God is calling us to be in that moment. And then really and truly letting that image be reflected in our liturgical practice. And it just makes the room for that, creates the space. Worship that breathes is also aware of the community. And in this awareness, it creates the space for the lived experiences of the community to show up in liturgical practice. And the lived experiences of the community are able to show up in liturgical practices in a way that is seen, heard, and valued. And if we are making room for the lived experiences of the different individuals in the space, we've made room for new encounter, creative encounter, not comfortable encounter, but creative encounter. So this is what we find in this creating space or making room for the creativity. Now, when we make room for creativity, we also have to know that we've got to create the space for flexibility. That was our fourth lesson. This is our fourth theme. Creative worship is not rigid worship. Creative worship does not mean, so here's the thing that I always get when I am in a space and I'm talking to folks and I use the word creative worship, they automatically think I'm like, throw out everything you've ever done and create something brand new. And I have to tell them, like, no, I don't even live my worship life that way. I share with you all, I'm a part of Providence Missionary Baptist Church. Providence Missionary Baptist Church is in Southwest Atlanta. It is 100, this year we will be 152 years old. This is a deeply traditional church. and there's yet room for creativity, which means we have had to bring in and create space for flexibility, which means that we couldn't just be stuck in our ways of doing the same thing. We had to imagine who was in the room, who was in the space, and begin to make small changes over time that allowed the room and the space for creative worship to happen, creative moments to happen, and that then caused us to have to become a pretty flexible congregation, a pretty flexible community in worship together. Hear me as I am saying the word congregation and the community, because it's not the leadership. It can't just be the leadership. This is cultivating a community that leans into the idea of worship breathing, because it requires the community to be flexible. One of the ways that I teach all of the time about this flexibility, I love to teach it to our students, because you would be surprised, a lot of our students come in and they are probably a little more rigid than some folks who I know who are in congregations. And they're like, no, but I really want it to be this way, and oh man, it didn't go right. Oh, we had this service, and on my team at Candler, I have 30 students who work for me every year in planning worship. And so they are so intent that worship is going to be this. Oh, they come to me, Dean Williams, we got it. The scripts are written. All the stuff is done. It's going to be great. And I'm like, okay, wonderful. But be prepared. Once that thing gets going, we don't know where it's going to go, right? And they're like, no. And there was one service that we had planned this year, and it was a beautiful service that our students had planned. And in the midst of it, one of the things that they were doing kind of failed, it dropped, and they were just heartbroken. Oh, man, they were like, wait, we have to go. Let's pick it up so we can finish the prayer practice. And, I'm just back there chuckling. They were like, why are you back here, laughing? And I always remind them, because worship breaks. And that's okay. Worship breaks. Because we are flawed, fallible people, called to attempt to do something that is divine, yet we are not divine. It is going to break. And when it does break, don't panic. Look and see where God is in the breaking. And so I told them, now let's think about, you had this whole station planned, and you wanted everyone to move in the space in a particular way. And then that kind of fell apart, and the stuff dropped and fell. And what happened immediately? Oh, there were a couple of folks who were in worship with us that went over and picked it up, and they were doing their thing, and they kept going. I said, right, they didn't move the way you wanted them to move, but they yet moved in a way that gave something to restoring the moment in the service. And that could have given them a different feeling of how they showed up in worship that day. Perhaps that's what was supposed to happen in the breaking. We don't know. But what we do know is that we have to be flexible, because worship does and will break. And it's okay. So this is where we create this space of flexibility. But all the things leading up to this help us. The intentional preparation and our planning, right, leads us into this. Our making room for creativity leads us to this space where we are able to actually lean in and be okay and be flexible when we see worship breaking. And then our fifth theme, the communal transformation. Now, when this approach, this understanding and recognizing and looking at how our worship breathes, does our worship breathe? When our worship breathes, It includes our full community. In including the full community, there's then an opportunity to be transformed together. I'm going to go back and read what I wrote about the class. Don't hear it as the reflection of a class. Hear it as a reflection of a worshiping community. Breath led to laughter. Laughter led to joy. Joy led to transformation, even in the smallest ways. And shared transformation led to deep learning. Why does this happen? When worship breathes and we make room for everyone in the space to breathe and to lean in and to be seen and to be heard, we then create community. Community that connects, community that makes room for one another, community that values one another, community that sees one another. And in that communal experience, it's no longer about doing the things the right way. It's about doing them together. And when we're doing worship together, as we are called to do it, we are then able to find moments of connection that bring about moments of joy, that then when something breaks, might even bring about moments of laughter, that then bring about moments of transformation. And the moments of transformation then can bring us to a space of learning. Because I believe every space is a space of learning. In worship, what are we learning? We are learning who God is in that moment and how God calls us to be in that moment and with one another. So these are our 5 themes. Now we are going to move to a coffee break. But like I told you, the coffee break does come with homework. So I would like you to take 30 minutes. We're going to take about 30 minutes or so. Grab coffee, grab pastries, and as you are grabbing your coffee and taking a moment, I want to invite you to just think on one of these 5 themes and begin to wonder, what does this have to do with my worshiping community? How can we breathe? How does this theme help us breathe in our worship? I will ask to hear back from you after our coffee break, so make sure you do your homework. Let's go. I'll see you all back in 30 minutes.
Thanks for coming back.
Okay. All right, so welcome back from your coffee break that I am going to believe all the conversation that I heard was you all working diligently over the homework and thinking about all the things that we've just explored and journeyed through. And a reminder that this is only a short amount of time that I have to even begin to kind of toss this out and share this thought with you. By no means is it an exhausted thought, but it is an opportunity for you to start thinking about this idea of worship breathing in your own worship context. And so with that in mind, I'd love to just hear from a few of you what you thought about taking one of these themes and thinking about it in your own context. How can your worship breathe in the way that we've talked about? So whether it's the communal transformation, whether it's the creating room for flexibility, making room for the creativity, if it's the cyclical rhythm, or even the intentional preparation and practice, intentional preparation and practice. What did you think about? What are some ways that you can see this happening in your own context? Yes?
I got mine.
Yeah.
Do you want mine?
Oh, no, you can just shout it out. I'll respond.
So our church is a weird little church with a number of people, but we have attracted a critical mass of young people with autism.
Mm-hmm.
And during children's time's a great example of not even worship breaking, but breathing.
I like it.
One of our boys went up and started playing the piano, which was banging.
Yep.
And I'm not gonna lie, I held my breath because I didn't know what my people were gonna do. His mom, came up, and another a speech therapist came up and sort of redirected. And so when he was done, the congregation applauded.
There you go. There you go.
And I sit there and say, I could not have planned that.
Nope.
I could not have really taught that, although my congregation says I model non-anxious presence. But I think of that as if someone had rushed and, slammed his hands down, if someone had, said, no, or someone had lectured me after church about it, that's not breathing worship.
That's right.
But in that moment, that has held such a special place.
Yep.
Of who the Spirit can be and the laughter and joy and transformation that comes out of that.
Exact. That is a perfect example. Thank you so much for sharing that. And hear what the initial reaction was. She held her breath. Right? Like, that's really what we do. We hold our breath. Whereas the congregation took a breath and let it happen. And then connected with it in the moment and applauded. And all of these themes, sans the intentional preparation and practice, because you cannot intentionally prepare that, but you can practice presence in the moment and breath in the moment, right? And then out of that, you then create this space for flexibility, and you make this room for creativity. And the community in that moment is then transformed. Remember, the transformation happens even in the smallest ways. And that child has an experience in a room full of people to be a part of worship.
And that child's mama knows it's okay.
Exactly.
And the house of God is for them.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. So I want us to move to an imaginative exercise before we close. And here's what you are imagining. With those who are around you, I want you to think about Easter, because Easter is coming. And imagine that you are planning worship for Easter. And you want to engage in worship that breathes. How do you approach thinking about Easter worship in a way that breathes? What do you imagine experiencing? What do you imagine planning? Let's take 4 minutes, not to plan a whole service, just to throw out a few themes. So remember I said at the beginning, I hope you like folks you are next to. If you don't, find good friends. Just become friends right now. If you don't know them, introduce yourself. And spend 4 minutes to just talk about, for Easter specifically, wanting to engage in worship that breathes. What do you imagine experiencing, and what do you imagine planning? When we come back, I will ask to hear from the different groups what you imagined together, and then I will lead into my conclusion, and we'll have time for Q&A. Let us go ahead and breathe in our imagination together.
Several years ago, we had kids get baptized of Emory University.
Okay, I'm going to invite us all to come back now. I hear lots of good conversation, which means we are imagining things. So I will invite us all to turn our attention back now. Okay, so the question was, let's think about Easter, and you're planning for worship, and you want to engage in worship that breathes. What do you imagine experiencing, or what do you imagine planning? What group wants to share a little bit first? Okay. Can we, yep, let's go ahead and give him a mic, yep. Thank you.
So we were very intentional about being inclusive with our children, starting on Monday, Thursday, where we had the foot washing. So that was the first movement. Mm-hmm. Then on Friday, the 7 last words. Mm-hmm. And then on Sunday, on Saturday, to strip the altar. Mm-hmm. For Sunday, the rolling away of the stone. Mm-hmm. And so it was a continual.
There you go.
To be inclusive and intentional.
See the cyclical body movement here. You see? There you go. I like it. So thinking through this continuum that connects all the way through. So it's not a Maundy, Thursday, we stop. Yeah. Good Friday, we stop. Yeah. Then Easter Sunday, but it is actually bringing it all together, and it becomes this cyclical rhythm that you engage. And the resurrection on Sunday. Exactly. Good job. Okay, thank you. Next group.
I was told to stand, so I am.
There you
My name is
go.
Nick Scott. I serve at Arbelon United Methodist. Charles and I, who serves the Indian congregation in Saxe, we're talking about breath. And I was warned by a colleague of mine before ordination interviews if I knew the difference between resuscitation and resurrection, because she got asked that question, and I said, oh, it's being brought back to life, to the old life, or getting new life. She was like, yeah, I didn't think of that, but yeah, that's what it is. But that got me thinking in the concept of breath. What does that first breath of resurrection sound like? Is it similar to what we see in the movies? I've never seen this in real life, where someone gets breath back and they go,
Exactly.
Is
it like that? Mm-hmm. Like breathing for the first time? And if you could incorporate those sounds into the breathing, or just have people focusing on the breath in that way. And then Charles had an idea. Well, it's his context is different, so you might want to explain that, about how he would use that breath concept at the end of worship.
Yep.
Mine is an Indian congregation, all Indians. So I cannot incorporate the actual breath into it because of the yoga thing. Yep. And the non-religious
That's
staying in worship and all. So what I imagined was the new breath, the new life. Mm-hmm. Jesus got back his breath. And as we go out, let us go with a new breath, new life.
Love that.
Into the world.
Love that.
So
Thank you.
I thought I'll do this in the end of the worship as they leave.
Look at that creativity.
Going forth.
We have sound, we have timing, a different way of looking at it. Thank you. Wonderful. Who's next? We have one here, and then we have a group over here.
I'll make this brief. Does anybody else have a problem with their music director being a control freak and not listening to the pastor?
Uh-oh.
I have absolutely no doubt that Satan came out of the choir, okay? Because
That's a whole nother workshop for a whole nother day.
No, but I have to tell you this. She kept complaining because I was running 5 and 10 minutes over with my sermon. So then I finally told the church, I said, if you have a problem with 5 or 10 minutes, additional minutes in worship, if you have a problem with additional 5 or 10 minutes in worship, maybe you need to rethink where you want to spend eternity. Because all of us, the rest of us, we're going to be up in heaven praising God 24/7. So therefore, you need to think about going to the other place. Amen?
All right. We had a hand over. I thought I saw a hand in this group. Okay, next group. We have over here and then in the back, either one.
Well, this might not be real creative because we were just having a good time sounding with each other. But our most creative worship at Easter is at our sunrise service because, first of all, it's outside. So you got the breath of the fresh air and the cool breeze, depending on what Easter's like. And it's a real small group, so we can be creative and we can be flexible because we're not constrained by the pews and we're not constrained by the organ and your music director doing whatever they want. Usually we sing a cappella, So that's how we get one way we get our creativity and our flexibility and our breath in our Easter worship is our sunrise service. And we call it sunrise, S-O-N. Sunrise service.
Love it. Very good. Let's get, we have 2 more. And then, so we have one who has a mic. We have the gentleman with his hand up here. Okay, we'll do 3 more. So well, he's raised his hand a few times. So we'll start with this young lady here. Nope, you have the mic. Go ahead and start, and then we'll do these last 2 after that. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll hand it off to you. Our group was talking about the experiential part of worship as well as having the tangible presence of different elements of resurrection so that people can have that breath of new life expressed in the many different ways that we have resurrection throughout our lives. But then Dr. Williams Newell was with us, had to leave. He also reminded us that the disciples thought it was all over. And so it reminded me of how we're still experiencing the impacts of COVID in our congregations and getting people back all at the same time, getting them active and involved and participating. And perhaps some in our congregations think that it's over, and how we breathe that new life in sending them out with this, it's not over. Think about the disciples who thought it was over, and God breathed that new life into Jesus and sent him forth, and we have new life because of that and are sent forth.
That's good. Yeah. That's really good. Thank you.
For the past 3 years, we've been suspicious of breath. Breath has been...
You're stealing my conclusion, but go ahead. I'm just kidding. Oh, go ahead.
The Spirit moves in mysterious
That's
ways.
right.
So thinking about breath, and breath as it relates to congregational singing, things that we could not do because they were life-threatening, how can we intentionally plan accessible congregational singing so that the whole church is breathing together? And it's not just singing out of a hymnal, but it's deconstructing the performative aspects of worship, transitioning to the participatory, and welcoming all the different traditions of worship, call and response, singing from the hymnal, improvisation, all of which speak resurrection and incorporate breath.
That's exactly right. Thank you. We had one more right here.
So we talked about getting creative with the scripture itself and making it interactive with the congregation. So if we follow just the women specifically as they arrive at the tomb, that gasp of breath to see the stone rolled away, and having the congregation feel that tension of holding your breath when you realize that, and the release when you see Jesus, of being able to let that go, and the panting of running down the road to go and tell, and the exhausted gasp of stupidity with the men when they don't believe. But feeling each of those breaths and the way that they go through the story is kind of where we were headed.
Listen, you all are on fire here, Brite. Let me tell you. Thank you. So you've heard a few creative ideas, and I hope it shows you that this concept of worship that breathes doesn't take a complete overhaul of what's being done. It simply takes a different way of thinking about how we do what we do in a more intentional way. And that gets to the heart of worship that breathes. Worship that slows down, thinks about how we're preparing, thinks about how we're practicing, doesn't think of itself as a worship that has to hurry up and end, but thinks of itself as something that is continuous in our public worship spaces and in our private lives, and creates space for creativity to flourish, the creativity of the collective, so all in the space can feel seen, heard, and valued. And creating that space, we make room then for flexibility, understanding that everything's not going to be perfect. So we have to strip away the perfectionists in us and surrender what we're doing to the Spirit of God, the breath of God. And while we are doing that and this space for flexibility is made, we then find ourselves engaging in communal transformation. That is worship that breathes. So what I didn't say at the very beginning of this was that while I started this project, I started it in the summer of 2019 with Wabash. And then March 2020 came around, and this thing called COVID-19 shut everything down. And while I'm over here thinking about breath, I'm also afraid to breathe. And then the heinous execution of George Floyd happens. And the words ring out, "I can't breathe." And I'm over here thinking about breath. And another black man is executed in the street and cannot breathe. And we all are afraid to breathe, and we all are wondering, what does it mean to not be able to breathe? And I'm over here thinking about breath. And so that did something for me and to me. And it made me realize, as I fast forward 2 years into 2022 and began this practice of having my community of worship breathe together, that this is not just necessary work for communities to learn how worship should breathe, but it's justice work. It is justice work that is reclaiming humanity, valuing the differences of humanity together. Why is it justice work? Well, I sat in Candler School of Theology's Cannon Chapel, an amazing edifice. And we sat in this service. And as I started the service, it was just on a random day. This is how Spirit works. I look up, and in the riser type, I call them the bleacher seats, the seats that rise up, I look and I see 7 faces of black male students right there. And it clicked for me. They need to breathe. And then I continued to look around, and I had students who were battling depression at an all-time high rate because of the trauma of a pandemic. And it dawned on me, they need to breathe. And I looked at faculty members who over just 2 years, we looked as if we saw each other and we said, my goodness, we have aged. Over the stress of figuring out how to quickly pivot in 2020 to teach online when we weren't prepared to do so. And some of us who are in academia and in the church, and so we're figuring out teaching online and worshiping online, and we're completely stressed out, and the gray hairs showed it. And it clicked to me. We need to breathe. So worship that breathes is just not a cute creative concept. It is a way to build community, and it is an act of resistance. And with that, friends, I simply say, is your worship breathing? Thank you. We will turn to Q&A.